Bible and turn to John chapter 21. You may be there already. If you've been here any length of time with us, you know where we're going this morning. If you're looking in your bulletin, you see a sermon outline there. So you know that we're in John chapter 21. And you probably know this is the last chapter of the Gospel of John. So we're nearing the end. You say you've been saying that for 6 months, but we are really nearing the end this time. We're getting close to finishing our sermon series through the Gospel of John. I plan plan to do 2 more messages from this chapter, and then we'll finish up John, Lord willing. And so we're chapter 1, and I'm going to do a big chunk of it this morning, the first 14 verses, because those verses kind of fit together as a unit. That's why I do that. So look at your Bible if you're holding it in your hand, your copy of the Bible or your tablet, or you can follow along on the screen. And it's always good for you to see these words as I read them, right? So John chapter 21. After these things, Jesus manifested Himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee, and He manifested Himself in this way. Simon Peter and Thomas called Didymus, or the twin, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of His disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to them, the rest of the disciples, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will also come with you." They went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus said to them, "Children, you do not have any fish, do you?" They answered Him, "No." And He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find a catch." So they cast, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John, said to Peter, "It is the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. Sounds like Peter, doesn't it? But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid, and fish placed on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have now caught." Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land, full of large fish, 153, and although there were so many, the net was not torn. Verse 12, Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples ventured to question Him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. This is now the 3rd time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after He was raised from the dead. I can't imagine any group of people that experience greater swings of emotions than did the disciples for the last few weeks that we've been reading about in John. If you think about it, in just the course of a couple of weeks, they had gone from the high hopes of Jesus entering Jerusalem to the cheers of thousands of people to the shock of seeing Him arrested in the garden. They then went from the devastation of the crucifixion to the joy of the resurrection. And then they went from seeing Him in the locked room 2 times to now they're in Galilee and they're wondering, what do we do now? What do we do now? I think they must have asked themselves that question a lot after the resurrection in those next few days. What now? Right? Because remember, they had given 3 years of their lives to this man, Jesus. They would have thought, we've left behind businesses, we have left behind family and relationships. What now? They thought they were going to have a position in the kingdom simply because they misunderstood the kingdom, and now they knew that was not going to be a possibility, and they thought, what now? We gave up everything. And what do we have to show for it? This dusty old boat, that's it. What now? What's for us? Jesus told us to leave Jerusalem, and here we are in Galilee, just like He said, but what now? There's no sign of Him. What are we supposed to do? What now? You ever been in a place in your life where things were tough and you experienced loss and there's chaos and confusion in your life and difficulty, and that's your question? What now? What now? What am I going to do? Where do I go from here? What's going to happen to me? What now? That's the disciples. That's the situation they found themselves in. What are we supposed to do? This is an amazing story, and you could spend a lot of time looking and dissecting the details, and you maybe could get lost in the details, but we're really going to look at some application from this event. I hesitate to use the word story because I don't want you to think that it's something that's made up. And so when I say story, just understand I'm talking about an event. I'm talking about something that really happened. And so we're going to look at the application from the story. How we can take what happened there on the Sea of Galilee and on the shore and apply it to our lives. This must have been at least 8 days after the resurrection, but yet Jesus had not gone back to heaven yet. So it was between 8 and 40 days. They had seen Jesus. Remember, a week after the resurrection, He appeared to them for the second time in that locked room, and that was the time that Thomas was with them, you may remember. And Jesus then said to those disciples, "Go to Galilee and wait for me there." And so that's where the story picks up. They're in Galilee, near the sea there, and that was very familiar to them. Many of that group had been from Galilee, so they knew where they were. They were in familiar territory. And so they were waiting on Jesus. There was that question, what now? What are we supposed to be doing? And then Peter, being the man of action that we know Peter to be. He wasn't always the man of the right action, but he was always a man of action. Peter jumps up one day and says, "I'm going fishing." He'd had enough waiting, right? Peter was this A-type personality, and he was used to going and doing and being active, and he had it with sitting around waiting on Jesus. And he said, "I'm going fishing." And Peter was a leader of men, right or wrong. He was a he was a leader of men. And so those other disciples said, "Well, we're going to go with you." And so here they go. They didn't know what to do, so they reverted back to what they could do. We do that sometimes. If we find ourselves confused in life, we revert back to what we know well. And so that's what they did. We don't know about this disciple thing. We don't know about this Jesus thing. We don't know where we're going from here, but we do know fishing. And so they went fishing. And then Jesus shows up on the seashore. And there's this interaction. And that's where I want to take some application this morning. First of all, I want you to see this bit of application. And it's very simply, self-sufficiency leads to failure and frustration. Self-sufficiency leads to failure and frustration. Simply put, I believe that one of the lessons Jesus wanted to teach to those disciples and to us, is that when we try to do things in our own strength, we are bound to fail. Did you get that? As Christians, as followers of Jesus, when we try to do things in our own strength and our own abilities and our own capabilities, we are bound to fail. And that failure will lead to frustration for most of us. Self-sufficiency is like kryptonite to us as followers of Jesus. The idea that I can do this Christian life on my own. You ever had that idea? Don't have that idea, right? The idea that I can do ministry, or I can help people, or I can progress in my walk with the Lord in my own strength and capabilities, that kind of self-sufficiency will lead to failure on our part. The idea that I can do this really pretty much without Jesus. That is a recipe for failure in the Christian life. And we see that truth illustrated here, just played out in picture form for us with the disciples. Here you have Peter, and there's 7 of them all total, right? And they go fishing. And now this is not like some of you with your bass boat and you get out on the lake for a few hours, and this is not that kind of fishing trip. You understand that? This is not about relaxation. It was about vocation. It was about making a living, because that's what they did. That's how they knew to make money, was to go fishing. This was a commercial fishing operation. This was not a leisurely drift down Shoals Creek, as nice as that sounds, right? They expected a payday. They wanted money out of this. And so a commercial fishing operation would have taken place at night. They would light a torch, and they would hold the torch out over the edge of the boat, and the fish would come attracted to that light, and they would throw a net. That seems kind of like an unfair advantage, doesn't it? Right? Is that legal these days? You fishing guys, can you do that, Eddie? Can you light it up and you can do that? That was an unfair advantage, but that's the way they caught fish back then, right? And so they were expecting to catch a big haul. But what do you see in verse 3? It says what? They had been fishing all night long, and they had caught nothing. That's my kind of fishing right there. They caught nothing. And so I want you to look back at verses 4 and 5. Read it for yourself as I read it, and see how Jesus helped them realize how much they needed Him. Right? Now this is fishing. This is something that is earthly and temporal, but it teaches a spiritual lesson. He wanted them to see how much they were going to need Him in the future for their ministry. When the day was breaking, verse 5, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples didn't know that it was Him. Jesus said, "Children, you don't have any fish, do you?" It's kind of a leading question, right? "You don't have any fish, do you?" And they said, "No." No. So it's dawn just about. It's barely getting light. And the disciples could see someone standing on the seashore on the beach, but they could not tell that it was Jesus. Now, lots of questions have been asked. How did they not know that it was Jesus? Well, it was just barely light, and they were 100 yards away, we see later in the text. So maybe it was just a matter of poor light and distance. Or it could have been Jesus looked differently after the resurrection. We don't know that. It could have been that He just hid His identity from them, like He did earlier after the resurrection. We don't know for sure, but the point is they didn't recognize them. But He wanted to point out to them the futility of their work, of what they had been doing. Now, they hadn't done anything wrong. He just wanted to use that as an object lesson, right? And so He asked them what was a somewhat embarrassing question. "You don't have any fish, do you?" You hear that? You hear the question? He didn't say, "How many did you catch?" That would not be a bad question. But in His question, there's really an answer. He said, "You don't have any fish, do you?" Now, if you've been out fishing all day long, and you come back into the dock, and you don't have any fish, wouldn't you love it if you've got a buddy on the dock waiting for you, and you're about 100 yards away, and he hollers out, "Hey, how many did you catch?" Now, I know how fishermen have a propensity to lie, right? Just like preachers do, right? Most fishermen I know would probably say, "Not too many," right? "How'd you do today?" "Didn't do too good." "How many did you catch?" "Didn't catch a thing," right? So that's kind of this situation. Jesus hollers from 100 yards away, "You don't have any fish, do you?" And obviously their answer was, "No, we don't." Now, did Jesus know exactly how many fish they had caught? He knew exactly how many fish they had caught, and it was nothing. So He wasn't asking a question for the purpose of information. He was asking the question for the purpose of admission. He was trying to get them to say the words, "No." Nothing. Zero, nada, zilch. We haven't caught one fish. The question was not for Jesus' benefit and His sake and His knowledge. It was to get the disciples to admit failure so that then they could accept, watch me, His help, right? It was all about their admission that they had not done any good all night long, despite their best efforts. Now, think about the significance of the fact that they had fished all night and had failed at that. They were experienced fishermen. They knew that lake better than they knew any place on earth, right? They had been raised there. They had had this operation for many years before Jesus called them. They made a living at it. They knew the secret places, and they knew the best techniques. If anybody should have caught fish that night, it was these men, and yet they came back empty-handed. Now, in just a minute, we're going to see that they end up with a boat full of fish with Jesus' help. But the point here is the contrast. Without Jesus, before He told them where to fish and how to fish, they caught what? Nothing. With Jesus' help, with Him telling them exactly where to fish and how to fish, they caught a boat full of large fish, the text tells us. Not just small ones, but big ones, and a boat full. And so the contrast couldn't be more clear for the disciples and for us. When we attempt to do things in our own way, by ourselves, in our strength and ability, the way we have always done them and that have been successful in the past, we are doomed to fail and lead to frustration. But when we do things Jesus' way, in His strength and in His ability and enablement, then the boat will get full of fish. The contrast is stark. The lesson and the truth is clear for the disciples then and for us now. Let me bring it down to us today, because the application is clear. We, dear church, and I'm talking to myself, we cannot live this Christian life in self-sufficiency. We cannot do what a Christian is supposed to do and live the way we're supposed to live on our own, in our own strength and our own self-sufficiency. It's a recipe for spiritual disaster. If we try to do this apart from Jesus, then we're going to have this same futility and failure as the disciples did that night on their fishing trip. And here's the thing. It doesn't really matter how talented we are at what we're trying to do. It doesn't matter how much experience we have at ministry and living the Christian life. Well, Pastor, I've been a Christian for 50 years. It doesn't matter how much training we have in education and what letters appear after our name, whether we've been to seminary or Bible school or not, or whether we were raised in the church. It doesn't matter how much determination I have. I'm going to overcome this and live the Christian life. None of that matters. And the disciples show us that. There were no better fishermen probably on the lake that night than these 7. And yet they came up what? Empty. You might think, and I might think, that I have every gift and resource and training and experience necessary to live the Christian life, and I can just do it on my own, and we're going to fail if we try that. We're going to fail if we try that. These men were way better fishermen than they were disciples, and yet they failed. Think about this, church. In the area of their greatest strength, without Jesus, they failed. You think about your greatest strength in your life, your experience, your training, your education, just your years of longevity in spiritual things. In your greatest area of strength, you and I will fail apart from Jesus. We just will. And the fact that the more I know about something, the more likely I am to try it on my own. You understand that? The more experienced I am at something, the more likely I am to try it without even asking Jesus to help me. Because I think, watch me, I got this. I've been doing this 25 years. I can do this in my sleep. I can get up there and preach a sermon that I barely prepared, never prayed over, and I can just do it and nobody will know the difference. Because that's my area of strength, right? We're going to fail if we don't rely on Him. Jesus addressed this in John chapter 15. It's so relevant to this. Look at John chapter 15, verses 4 and 5. He said, we ought to learn these verses, church. Listen, abide in me and I in you. That means stay close. Stay connected. You get that? Abide in me. Do you see it? As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it connects to or abides in the vine, so neither can you, what? bear fruit or produce anything of spiritual worth unless you abide in me. He said, you're just like the vine and the branch. If you cut the vine off or separate it from the branch, you're not going to get any fruit. So stay connected. He said, I'm the vine and you're the branches. He who stays connected in me abides in me and I in him. He bears much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. When it comes to us producing spiritual growth and spiritual harvests and results, it's all about staying connected to Jesus. Because without Him, we can do nothing. There is no such thing, hear me, church, as a self-made man spiritually. I'll just say this. I hate that term. There's no such thing as a self-made man, period. You know, you hear stories about, well, so-and-so, you know, they were born in poverty and they didn't have anything and they just worked hard and look at what they have achieved all on their own. That is hogwash. They did that because of the grace of God in their life, right? And spiritually speaking, there's no such thing as a self-made man or woman spiritually. Apart from Jesus, we can do nothing. We can't have any results. We can't have any growth. We can't produce anything good. In our own strength, we can do nothing. And we get frustrated and we give up as Christians in spiritual things because we're not catching any fish. And the problem is we're trying to do it without Jesus. You know, I think I can overcome this temptation and this sin if I just try hard enough. Not going to happen without Jesus. You know, I think I can overcome these obstacles that are keeping me from growing spiritually. Not going to happen without Jesus. I think I can fill in the blank. Preach, teach, serve, sing, share the gospel, stay in the nursery, lead a ministry, do whatever without Jesus. Not going to happen. Apart from Him, we can do nothing. But when we admit our weaknesses and our lack of strength and our inability, then God can tell us where to catch fish. Then we can see results. He can work through us and produce in us what He can do. The net full of fish would have never happened without those disciples admitting that they had had no fish all night long. Without admitting their inability. When they said no, you didn't catch any fish, did you? No. At that point, they were able to be used of God. Because when we admit our inability, then we get God's ability. Look at 2 Corinthians 12. Great verses. Paul's talking about a conversation he had with God and through prayer, right? When Paul was admitting his need for God's help. God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. You get that principle, guys? Power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, Paul said, I will rather boast about my weaknesses. I'll say no when I didn't catch any fish. So that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Look at the next verse. Therefore, I'm well content with weaknesses. What? Content with weaknesses? With admitting that I don't have any strength, and with insults and distresses and persecution, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am what? What does it say? Then I am strong. When I admit my weakness, that's when I'm at my strongest. When I think I'm strong, that's when I'm at my what? Weakest. We sang a song earlier, and the words hit me out of the when we sang it. You are my strength when I am weak. You are my strength when I'm... You know when you can really do things for the Lord? When you admit that you really can't do anything for the Lord. That it has to be Him. Self-sufficiency always leads to failure. Secondly, by the way, the third point's really short, right? I like to let you know where we're going, how long it's going to take us to get there. Third point's really short. But this is only the second point. Second thing I want you to see is that there's always blessing in obedience. Another simple truth. There's always blessing in obedience. When we obey God, hear this, church, when we obey God and do what He tells us to do, there will always be blessing. That's not complicated, is it? Obedience is not complicated. It's us that are complicated when it comes to obedience. When we obey God, there will always be blessing. Look back at verse 6 and we see this illustrated. Jesus said to them, remember they had just said what? We didn't catch a thing all night. What did he say in verse 6? Take the net and throw it on the right side of the boat and you will find a catch. They did and they did, right? They cast on the other side from where they had been fishing and they caught so much that they could not pull the net into the boat. They had to just bring the boat to shore eventually. Jesus told them what to do. They did it, and there was a blessing. There was a huge blessing, an abundant blessing. And so the application for us, not about fishing, but about the Christian life, is when we obey Him, there is blessing, period. When we obey Him, dear church and dear pastor, there's blessing. Notice that the disciples did not argue with Jesus when He told them where to fish. They did not delay. They did not question. They did not debate. They just did it. J.C. Ryle said, our Lord's object was to show the disciples that the secret of success was to work at His command and to act with implicit obedience to His word. I love that last phrase. Jesus wanted them to act in implicit obedience to His word. That means obedience without question, obedience without reservation, without debate, without excuses. Why is it such a big deal that they obeyed the way they did without question? They just did it. Well, because it didn't make a lot of sense what Jesus told them to do from a human perspective. Think about all the excuses they had for not doing what Jesus told them to do and obeying Him. Remember, at that point, they didn't know it was Jesus, right? They were the professional fishermen. They'd been at this their whole life. They just took a little 3-year break. They were the experts in this field. They knew the lake. They knew how to catch fish. Who did this guy think he is to show up and tell us what to do? We're the professionals here. We've got a degree in fishing. It's a master's degree, right? I've been to seminary to learn how to catch fish. Who does this guy think he is telling me how to catch fish? And by the way, what's the difference in the right and the left side of the boat? The boat's only about 3 feet wide. How much difference can that make? And we're the ones who know what's going on here. Who does this guy think he is? We've always fished on the left side. That's just the way we've done things. We're left side fishermen. We're not right side fishermen. See all the excuses? They could have named them, but they didn't. They just did what Jesus said, and there was this great blessing. They didn't use excuses, and that's our tendency, isn't it? Can we get real here for just a minute? Our tendency, my tendency, is to make excuses to God instead of just obeying Him. Do you do that? You have a tendency to say, yes, God, but. Well, God, I'll do that, but. And God, don't you know that? Do you ever make excuses rather than just obeying God? I do. We make excuses rather than just obeying Him. What God wants is obedience, not excuses. I don't imagine there would have been any fish to be caught if the disciples had said, hold on now, wait a minute, Jesus, let's talk about this. Or we don't know who you are, guy, but we just want you to know this is why that won't work. There would not have been any fish caught. They did not make excuses. Can you imagine? Watch me now, stay with me. If we look at God from a human tendency, can you imagine how weary He must get of hearing our excuses? Right? Can you imagine how weary, if God gets weary, which He doesn't, but do you imagine how weary God gets of hearing from you and from me? Well, God, I just can't do that because. God, I just can't do that, and here's why. Let me tell you, can I be real blunt? I get tired of hearing excuses, and I'm just a pastor, right? I can't tell you how tired I get of hearing excuses. Listen, I am so experienced in hearing excuses, I know more about excuses than the people who give them to me, right? I know, hear me, this is funny, I know the excuses I'm going to hear from which people before they say it. That's how experienced I am at hearing excuses. But that's not the big deal. The big deal is when we make excuses to God, right? God, I can't do that right now, and here's why. God, I'll obey, but I've got to do this first. Let me ask you, what area of life are you making excuses in right now instead of just obeying Him? What area of life, if you were brutally honest, would you say, I know that I should do this because God has told me to in His Word, but here's why I'm not? You're making excuses. What area? Is it an area of ministry or involvement in the church or service? But you're saying no. Is it some questionable habit that's not good for you spiritually? And you know it, but you keep making excuses. Or maybe it's sin that keeps defeating you. Maybe it's in giving. Maybe it's in worship or praying or reading the Word or sharing your faith. What area of your life are you refusing to obey God in? The thing is, obeying God is always for our good. It's always for our good. It's never to squash our fun, as some of us think. It is always for our good. It is so that we would have, instead of empty nets, we can have full nets. Living in disobedience always means our nets will be empty. Listen, Christian, if you're living in disobedience to God, it doesn't matter what the world thinks of you. All that matters is you're living in disobedience to God. It doesn't matter how big your house is, how good your job is, how your kids dress, what kind of car you drive, how the world thinks you are on your way to the top. If you're living as a Christian in disobedience, that's all that matters, and that will keep you from experiencing the blessing of God. Now, listen, I'm not preaching the prosperity gospel here. You know me better than that. I'm not saying if you'll just do this, you're going to go to your mailbox tomorrow and it'll be stuffed full of cash. By the way, if you do, call me, right? I'll come help you with that. What I'm saying is, if you obey Him, He's going to bless you in ways you can't even imagine. In ways way more important than financial and material things. And God never skimps. He never just barely blesses. You notice the nets were not just kind of full or half full, and they didn't have just kind of small fish. These were large fish, the Bible says, and the nets were full. They were so full that they couldn't pull them in. They had to just take the whole boat and everything to shore. That's the way God blesses when we obey. Here's your third one. Jesus offers forgiveness and fellowship after our failures. There's some fascinating things about this scene that we'd like to talk about, like where did Jesus get the fish and the bread, right? They get there and He's already got fish on the grill and bread. Where did that come from? Did He bring it from the store? Did He just create it out of nothing, right? Because He can do that. He did it back in Genesis 1:1, right? We don't know, but there was this meal. Disciples get to the shore and Jesus is cooking. Can you imagine that scene? Seeing Jesus grilling fish and heating bread over a charcoal fire. Isn't that a great scene? But it was more than just a meal that was going on. In that day, we love to eat together, don't we? We love to have fellowship. And it's great when we do that. I love when men get together. We have men's breakfast once a month, and we eat together for man church. And men love to eat together, and I guess you women do too. That's just the way we're made. And that's special, but nothing like it was in that culture. In that culture, when you ate a meal with somebody, that was an intimate event with close friends. You didn't eat with people that were your enemies. You didn't eat with people that you didn't like. You didn't eat with people that you were in conflict with or that you had something against. You only ate with your closest friends. Jesus said to these disciples who had, watch me church, had failed at almost every turn. At almost everything they had tried, they had failed at. They had denied Him. They had ran away from the cross. They had left behind being a disciple and apparently decided to just take up fishing again. Everywhere you turn, you see failure on the part of the disciples, and yet here's Jesus saying to them, "Oh, come on around and let's eat." You think that resonated with those disciples that wondered if they would ever do anything significant again? Who wondered if Jesus could ever forgive them for running away from the cross and hiding out behind locked doors? Could Jesus ever forgive us? Jesus said, yeah. As a matter of fact, come on in and let's eat together. May I say to you this morning that no matter what you may have done and what area you may have failed the Lord in, Jesus will forgive you. And He will restore you back to a close relationship with Him. He will bring you back in around the fire and He will eat dinner with you. That's how close He wants to be to you. Some of us get discouraged and we want to give up because we fail and fail and fail and fail Jesus. He doesn't give up on us. He's ready to take us back in if you'll only confess and repent and come back to Him. Is that where you are this morning, maybe as a Christian? You would say to me, Pastor, you don't know what I've done, and I've really blown it, and my past is just ugly, and I don't think I'll ever be anything for the Lord. May I say to you that the disciples won a word because they had blown it, and yet Jesus restored them. Or maybe as a Christian this morning, you would say, Pastor, there's this area and this area of my life where I know that I'm living in disobedience. I'm not being completely obedient to Him, and I want to confess that and move forward in the Lord. Is that you this morning? Is that you where you're at? Or maybe you're here as a Christian and you're trying to do it all yourself. You're trying to accomplish spiritual things in human strength, and your nets keep coming up empty. You're just not making any success. Would you say this morning to the Lord, I can do nothing. Jesus, I can do nothing on my own. I'm just like Paul, and I want my weakness to be made your strength. Would you say that this morning as a follower of Jesus, as you seek Him? I want you to stand with your heads bowed this morning and let that message and those questions resonate in your heart this morning as music plays, and perhaps there's a decision that you need to make this morning. You need to do business with the Lord, as they said in the old days. Maybe where you stand, or maybe you need to come and kneel in the altar, or come and say, Pastor, I've got this decision I need to make. Pastor, would you help me with this? Pastor, would you pray with me? Pastor, I need to be saved this morning. Heads are bowed, eyes are closed.